Hi everyone and welcome. Thank you for attending our virtual presentation. My name is Elisa. I teach at the Federal University of Pelotas in Brazil, and I'll be presenting on this topic with my colleague Bruna. Our presentation is titled How to Engage L2 Learners in Transnational Dialogue Through Podcasts.
Hi, I'm Bruna. I teach at Michigan State University. Elisa and I have experience teaching Portuguese as an additional language in 2 different countries and in 2 different educational settings. And in our conversations, we were intrigued by the crescent use of podcasts as genres people turn to for different purposes. We believe that they can certainly contribute to engaging our students not only in the classroom, but also in a community of speakers worldwide. We hope you can make connections with your own target languages as well, and we look forward to reading your feedback and for ongoing discussions in the chat. In this presentation, we will share pedagogical materials that we designed to implement in our teaching contexts, and we'll describe our teaching context in a moment. But first, the main question underlying the design of these materials was, how can podcasts be used in different L2 settings to promote transnational dialogue and intercultural competence? One of the key aspects of our practice and the proposals we are going to discuss here is the learner as a producer of knowledge. So the goal for us to achieve in that case is to provide students with tools to access these podcasts. So it has to do with understanding the podcast production and distribution process in the first place, but also it has to do with the implications of linguistic and cultural dimensions that are present in each episode and each channel that we choose to analyze, right? And to do so, we need also to guide them to question traditional views about who and what forms and discourses represent this target language. In order to prepare our students to critically analyze linguistic and cultural representations in these genres, we also needed to critically analyze the sociopolitical and historical aspects involved in teaching an additional language in these different contexts. There is an increasing debate in the field of Portuguese as an additional language, and this may be true for the context of your target languages as well. We've been seeking to incorporate the notion of pluricentric language in an attempt to decentralize countries of reference in order to question what is considered as a legitimate speaker of that target language and what they bring as cultural references that are usually interpreted as the target language cultural practices, and the linguistic variety, which is usually interpreted as the standard and the imagined goal our students want to achieve. So we bring this notion here because the notion of pluricentric language guides our materials design, but we also reflected on the impact of this notion on our learners and their local realities as L2 speakers of Portuguese. For example, working with Portuguese as a pluricentric language involves acknowledging language use in all these countries that you see here in the slides. Besides Brazil and Portugal, Portuguese is an official language in 7 other countries: Cape Verde, Guiné-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, São Tomé and Príncipe, East Timor, and Equatorial Guinea. It is spoken in Africa, Europe, and Asia, and over 245 million people speak it as first or second language to a different degree. Portuguese is also present in the diaspora countries such as the US, Canada, Japan, South Africa, Paraguay, and Venezuela, and it's also among the 10 languages most used on the internet. So the notion of pluricentric language guides our materials design, but when we think of the impact of this notion and these reflections on our learners and their local realities as L2 speakers of Portuguese, the notion of transnational language seemed to better translate the influences of a podcast as a genre they would be appropriating, both as consumers and producers. Seeing Portuguese as a transnational language implies acknowledgement of this historical dispute between power centers that are represented by nation-states like Portugal and Brazil, with whom the language keeps ties metonymically, right? I'm learning Brazilian Portuguese. I'm learning Portuguese from Portugal. This perspective is followed by Zoppi Fontana, who we quote here, and she defines transnational language as this imaginary and symbolic projection of a language within a space of dispute for representation that goes beyond nation-state boundaries. So we want our students to create their enunciation spaces, their speech selves per se, and embrace that plurality of their own multiple linguistic repertoires, and including Portuguese in its different varieties, including their very own variety, the one that they are developing as learners. Okay, so these are the contexts for which these materials were created. The first one is a Portuguese as a foreign language class for undergraduates in the United States. Usually they may be majoring in Spanish, doing a minor in Portuguese. That will depend on the institution.
In the Brazilian setting, most graduate students come from other Latin American countries such as Colombia, Venezuela, Paraguay, and Mexico. The graduate programs in plant protection, social memory and cultural heritage, and agronomy receive the largest number of students attending either a MSc, MA, or a PhD program. In the first setting, an episode from a podcast produced by Black women was used. This podcast is an example of a chat show where a host and one or more guests take turns discussing specific topics. For the second setting, we used 3 episodes from different podcasts, 2 by science communication programs produced at Brazilian universities, and one by a French public radio service that broadcasts in 12 languages. They were all short episodes, around 10 minutes each, that resemble quick burst podcasts, which aim at delivering an important piece of information rapidly. The term less commonly taught languages comes from the context of the teaching of foreign languages in the US, but if we look at the status of Portuguese in the academic scenario worldwide, the dispute of using Portuguese as a language of science and academia is visible and also positions Portuguese in place in which we need to make visible the importance of producing academic knowledge in Portuguese and foster students' critical awareness of why doing so is important. Moreover, producing knowledge in Portuguese is not only helpful for the graduate students in Brazil because they are here, but also because it allows them to share with a broader audience, particularly from countries in the global south. The status of Portuguese as a critical language in the US translates the increasing need for professional speakers of these languages while there is short supply in the market. This is true for jobs inside the US, but this need has increasingly expanded to other scenarios, especially online spaces, and means to support them as Portuguese is one of the 10 languages most used on the internet. The choice for the genre podcast was not random. Besides having become more widespread outside instructional or educational spaces, educators have researched the potential benefits they bring to the classroom, such as the way it adapts to learners' needs and purposes. Not only they are a resource for conveying knowledge, they can also be used as a tool to create knowledge, since they can be produced by those who can afford simple yet not widely available technological resources. It also helps learners understand the practice surrounding their distribution and production and puts them in touch with an audience beyond the classroom. In many academic contexts, L2 language instruction has a strong emphasis on written genres, but we believe it is relevant to include a variety of genres, including oral texts. Podcasts are a great addition because they are multimodal and digital genre. These are constantly evolving and their technological developments bring new possibilities of meaning-making for learners. When it comes to oral genres, podcasts are particularly interesting because they take place in the public realm, which is not usually the case with most oral genres in the L2 classrooms. Podcasting promotes learner autonomy since learners can access authentic resources in the target language with a variety of formats and therefore can choose what to listen to and how to become responsible for their learning. It promotes informed participation in different social realms with access to diverse representations of groups and discourses, so learners can choose what groups they identify mostly with. Also, they are expected to play the role of cultural mediators, since in order to understand different points of view, learners need to decenter from their own experiences. This helps students embrace and develop their own voices both metaphorically and literally. It promotes transnational dialogue, since it allows access to voices from different countries, even though we know that technology is not accessible to the less privileged, and it intends to foster an idea of decentralized representation of who speaks the language, showing that they can embrace themselves and contribute to a community that is bigger than the nation-state boundaries used to frame a community of speakers. It promotes genre awareness and multiliteracies, and here we highlight the importance of bringing different authentic podcasts and reflect on their social rhetorical purposes and how they are realized through fast-evolving, highly multimodal means of meaning-making. Podcasts can foster genre awareness regarding these modes. For example, some texts are written to convey meaning conveyed via written supports, such as journals, magazines, or newspapers, whereas other texts are written to be read out loud, like in teleprompters in TV news or pre-planned podcasts. In this sense, working with podcasts of different formats, whether involving scripts or created through spontaneous talk or dialogues, can raise students' awareness about the multiplicity of specific genres. It also promotes intercultural competence because not only it exposes learners to surface-level features of language, such as different linguistic backgrounds, accents, etc., but it also, which raises their social linguistic awareness, but they are also confronted with multiple points of views, with access to legitimate and sometimes silenced voices.
So the lesson I'll be sharing with you today is part of a broader project that I produced as a Circle Research Fellow in 2019, so the acknowledgements go for them as well. The lesson I'm sharing with you today aims to familiarize students with negotiation of identities by Afro-Brazilians through the interpretation of a podcast episode in a poem, and reflect about the use of the words preto and preta, which means black in Brazilian Portuguese. The podcast I will be examining is called Pretas na Rede, which means black on the web, and it gives voice to black women and illustrates the importance of occupying all spaces, including the web. So I included their timeline, and it more or less represents how the whole series of lessons is structured. First, we start getting to know communities through podcasts. Then the stories of places form a community. That's where we listen to podcasts about different places within a community. And the third one is the one I'm sharing with you today. Stories of people's lives form a community. And then the last one is when students have the opportunity to create their own podcast and talking about stories that form their own community. So this first activity here aims to foster students' genre awareness, and it requires students to identify the rhetorical moves commonly found in podcast introductions. Usually the speakers add a vignette with music, they mention the podcast title, their motto, they ask for likes, comments, and social media followers. So that's what they do in this number 1. And in question number 2, students are invited to reflect about the content, and they make connections to the social context. So in this case, the podcasters explain that their mission is to expand the presence of melanin, a metaphor for the presence of black people on the web and in the world. So these questions really seek to promote the discussion about the need to increase participation of black people in Brazilian society, but also in other countries, so they can make connections to their own countries, and in this case, the United States. This discussion is also important because it will produce the cultural-based knowledge needed to interpret the podcast episode and the poem that also is included in this lesson. So the principles of this lesson are also aligned with one of the fundamental goals of a pedagogy of multiliteracies, which we have mentioned earlier, and this is to create the conditions for learning to support the growth of people who are able to articulate and enact their own identities, but that who can also find ways of entering into dialogue with and learn new and unfamiliar social languages. And social languages is the term used by Copenhagenensis. So this episode here can be seen as a window to voices and identities that may be new for the students. So what happens in this episode is that the host invites 2 other speakers to talk about their favorite words in Portuguese. So they name many of them, and one of the speakers says that she has chosen the word black because that word has many meanings for her. And what we emphasize here is that black means different things for each person. They talk about how that word resonated with them based on different lived experiences. Gabby realizes that the word black has been resignified by current movements in her own life. It has turned from a negative word from a word that is used to demonstrate pride and power. Within the same community then, they had different experiences and awareness about the use of the word black. So the idea here is to make visible the complexity of identity and experiences, which are local, but they are even more complex because they are personal and they change from one person to another. So being aware of this fuzzy and overlapping boundaries is something that a chat podcast revealed to us, and it can show the student that the discomfort with word choices resides not only when someone speaks a language as an L1 or as an L2, but it's something that also stems from socio-historical uses and represent a passive oppression and lack of social justice in the case of the vocabulary and in the case specifically of this word black, right? So we can reflect about how this episode allows us to observe and examine the intersection between word choice, identity, ideology, and socio-historical use of the word black in Portuguese, and it also has to do with intercultural competence. So this is what I'm highlighting for you in the first word bubble, but what I'm highlighting in the second bubble then is how the formal dimension of the genre also intersects with its meaning. So we see that they have different experiences because that's what Gabi replies. She says, "Wow, Ladi, I had never thought about this." So when she says that, we have the hint that in this case, which is a chat show, the dialogues are not carefully pre-planned, so there is no script to the what they are saying, And along the lesson, we will examine intonation and other discourse markers besides this sentence to better understand how are all these hints constructed, so we know that this episode is not pre-planned. So my point here is how we can tie genre conventions in this case, a more freely structured podcast episode with such an important cultural topic, which is the negotiation of the speaker's identities. So these questions direct students' attention to how others have used the word black and how Ladi perceived this use in her life. So these questions aim to raise students' awareness about effects of racism and the use of words such as preta by different groups, and how we need to be mindful of the history behind these uses to avoid language use that indexes racism. So question 5C here seeks to systematize the topic through a visual word map. And students will add words such as empowerment and offense to understand the complex relationship between these words. So, for example, preto and preta, black, are words used among those who identify as part of the black community in Brazil, and that can be associated as with empowerment. But depending on who uses this word, it can be read as racism if it's used by someone who is not inserted in the community, so that can be associated with offense. So students need to be mindful and aware of these uses. So you won't have time to go over the whole lesson, but this is just to give you an idea that based on the reflection in which the speakers in the podcast were talking about their identities and their word, that's those words that represented a negotiation of identity, I asked students to also choose one word that represented something meaningful for their story, for their identity, and maybe about their life in that specific city or university to keep it local. The words don't need to be in Portuguese because we want to embrace their multilingual repertoire and acknowledge the complexity of those multilingual identities. But the exercise asks them to explain the meaning of that word for speakers of Portuguese. We want to keep that a Portuguese-speaking audience in mind and make sure that we can consider those multilingual repertoires as inclusive of Portuguese as well. So this is aligned as well with the context in which this material was produced too. In the United States, many undergraduate students who study Portuguese are bilingual Spanish-English speakers, so it may be expected that they are used to this shuttling between languages as part of their everyday practice. And Spanish speakers in the U.S. may as well have faced oppressive situations, maybe they were related to the use of certain words. And even though these are different socio-historical complexities, being able to make connections between realities is something that the L2 class also should have space for. So we also want to create a space for students to become comfortable with themselves, as well as flexible enough to collaborate and negotiate with others who are different to themselves in order to forge this common interest. So this is another way to construct an idea of language produced to transgress national boundaries and include their identities as speakers of other languages, as now speakers of Portuguese, when they talk about all these complexities in Portuguese as well.
The idea for this material originated as the graduate students, while taking an academic writing course, indicated that they would like to take another one for improving their pronunciation in Portuguese. Also, during the same course, something happened over and over again. We discussed how many genres are addressed for specialists, and the students felt it was really important also to communicate science to a broader audience, particularly in a moment where there seems to be a worldwide attack on science. So I decided to create a short course, joining these two needs, and this is how podcasts seem to fit perfectly. So I chose 2 episodes about COVID-19 and the technological advancements helping find coronavirus, and another one about science denialism. Pronunciation is one of the focal points of the material, as learners specifically mention their interest on it. And since we know that our course could not cover all phonetic and phonological aspects of Portuguese, one of our aims was to foster learners' autonomy so that they could know where to look for more information. This is a pronunciation activity that requires learners to access online resources about Portuguese phonetics. It was specifically designed having in mind remote or online instruction while the COVID-19 pandemic lasts. Here, the instructor acts as a mediator between the content available and the learner needs. It also makes learners aware that there are other ways to pronounce sounds besides the instructors. And the use of IPA symbols is also an important tool for learners, since once it is mastered, it makes it easier for them to find out information about pronunciation, which in turn increases their knowledge of the target language and also their autonomy. Here, learners are asked to listen to some episodes of 3 different science communication podcasts and, using the criteria previously discussed in the classroom, come up with a description for each podcast. They need to pay attention to more surface level features such as duration, frequency of new episodes, subjects, and also to issues such as the people involved in the social settings and contexts of communication, that is, in the production, presentation, and reception of the podcasts. They need to be aware of who these people are, their social roles and stances. This task helps learners to identify regular features and conventions of the genre and also shows that there can be room for variation. This is a screenshot of the episode page, which deals with the use of telemedicine during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how a team of scientists at USP, São Paulo University, is developing a project to make it available to the community. After they listen to it, there are questions about the people and the fields involved in the project, and those who were selected to give interviews for the episode. The first question makes learners reflect on the areas involved in this project, not only the ones mentioned in the podcast, but other areas that could potentially contribute to its development. The second question invites learners to think as producers. What are the reasons that these people and not others appear in the podcast? Would they have consulted other people, and if so, who would it have been? This question acknowledges that there are reasons behind each choice and that some other voices could be heard. Here we have an example of a task exploring language variation after learners listen to the Portuguese podcast. Although this one focuses on pronunciation, there are other activities dealing with other linguistic levels that display differences between the Brazilian and European varieties. This task raises learners' awareness of these differences so that they can better understand not only this podcast episode, but also other texts in this variety. For the graduate students, this means that being a Portuguese speaker also gives them access to knowledge produced in other varieties of this language, which brings voices previously unheard. And in an attempt to decolonize knowledge and knowledge production practices, it calls into question what is considered to be legitimate sources of knowledge, the places where knowledge usually comes from, and who can participate in its sharing practices worthwhile. Does it help learners embrace their roles as researchers who are aware of the cultural diversity in science? This is the follow-up task where learners choose the phoneme that is heard in the sample oral texts used in the classroom. It points not only to the differences between countries but also within the same country by explicitly asking learners to think of the Portuguese language they are used to listening to in Pelotas, and also by stating that there are other varieties in Brazil where the sounds are produced differently. The rationale behind this activity is to help learners understand that, while there are forms more commonly used in some contexts and/or regions, the so-called standard language is a homogeneous and largely idealized version of the language, which is not even spoken by native speakers. Variation is the norm, so learners should be aware of how this happens in their communities and also in their own productions as they learn a second language. This task also deals with language variation, but in this case with the register chosen for the podcast. Learners are given an approximate transcription of part of the Portuguese episode and are asked to think about how the intended audience and purpose of the episode shape the language that is being used. They need to provide textual clues to justify their answer. And since the podcast is targeted to a lay audience, the language to describe a process in this excerpt, which is how a COVID-19 test works, contains expressions such as that is and this means that, which allows the speaker to rephrase their ideas differently. It also seems to give an account of how a person could be responsible for making this process happen instead of describing it as taking place independently. The variation in register becomes more evident when learners compare the previous excerpt with this text, which was taken from a paper about tests for COVID-19. I selected the part of the article that describes a similar process, and even as a layperson can see, the language is very different, with a prevalence of acronyms to refer to viruses and techniques, for example. After reading the two texts, learners compare and contrast the linguistic features in both texts and to describe the testing technology and to refer to the process and the elements involved. The language changes in these two texts are shaped by the audience and the purpose of each genre. Learners need to be aware of these differences and prepare in advance for how they will convey some pieces of information when the time for producing their own scientific communication podcasts comes. Moreover, this also helps them reflect on what their roles and responsibilities as scientists are and how they can contribute to fight scientific misinformation through science communication. So, to conclude, apart from the benefits to L2 learning due to podcasts being an authentic material about current affairs brought into the classroom, we believe that working with this genre can show how speaking in L2 gives learners access to other points of view and realities which, in turn, can help them rethink and reshape their own realities in their local communities. This goes along with the fact that public oral genres are not commonly incorporated into L2 classrooms, which usually frame a reality within non-public and personal realms. However, our proposals emphasize that the L2 can contribute to the local community through reception and production of public and digital oral genres like podcasts as well. In this sense, we believe that the very notion of local community can be shaken by digital genres, since everyone who has access to the podcast can be a part of a community of listeners and producers. Learners L2 is thus no longer restricted to the classroom, but plays an important role in broadening their possibilities for meaning-making and civic engagement elsewhere or wherever the language is spoken. This notion also plays an important role in who is recognized as a speaker of the target language and opens possibilities for them to identify with a broader range of group of speakers of that target language. And, to conclude, working with podcasts is another possible way to develop the much-needed new multiliteracy skills required for an active engagement in education and work environments, not to mention the civic role.
Thank you for watching our presentation. These are the references we used for this presentation. Thanks again for watching our presentation. These are the emails. We are looking forward to hearing from you. We would love to get to know your feedback and to get to know more about your context if you think that podcast is something suitable for your own learners. If you want to receive a copy of the materials as well, do not hesitate to email us. Both Elisa and I will be very happy to continue this conversation in the asynchronous conversations as well. The material that I produced as a Circle Research Fellow in 2019 will soon also be available through the Circle website. Thank you again.